Something unusual is happening in global politics right now, and it isn't happening in a way that demands immediate attention. There are no sirens, no emergency broadcasts, no sudden moment where the world collectively looks up and realizes something has changed. Instead, this moment feels quiet, almost gentle, like pressure slowly building beneath the surface. History often moves like this, not with noise, but with weight. Not with chaos, but with accumulation. Institutions that once symbolized permanence and stability are beginning to feel uncertain. Structures that were designed to manage cooperation, conflict, and global balance are being openly questioned. Not emotionally, not recklessly, but thoughtfully. And once again, standing at the center of this conversation is Donald Trump. This moment doesn't feel explosive. It feels consequential, like the early signs of a shift that most people won't fully recognize until it has already reshaped the world around them. Hi, I'm Janus Juno. Thanks for being here. Today I want to talk about what's really going on in the world. Not just what we see on the surface, but what it might actually mean underneath it all. This isn't about reacting to headlines. It isn't about political drama, and it isn't about choosing sides. It's about direction. It's about momentum. It's about where global power is moving and why that movement matters more than most people realize. And before we go any further, I want to be honest with you. This conversation isn't simple. It doesn't offer easy answers. But it does ask important questions. The United Nations. What it was meant to be? For decades, the United Nations has been presented as the backbone of global peace and cooperation. It was created after devastation on a scale the world had never seen before, after cities were reduced to rubble, after millions of lives were lost. The UN was born from a shared realization. Unchecked power had pushed humanity too far. The idea behind it was deeply human. Bring nations together, create dialogue instead of destruction. Replace revenge with rules. Replace isolation with cooperation. At its core, the vision was noble. The world needed a place where conflicts could be discussed before they turned into wars, where smaller nations could speak in a system dominated by stronger ones. And in its early years, the United Nations mattered. It helped prevent some conflicts from escalating. It coordinated humanitarian relief when suffering crossed borders. It created diplomatic spaces where rivals could speak instead of immediately reaching for weapons. It didn't solve everything, but it slowed things down. And in global politics, slowing things down can save lives. When the world began to change. But the world did not stand still. Power shifted, technology accelerated. Information began traveling faster than diplomacy ever could. Conflicts stopped being simple. They became economic, digital, ideological, strategic. Energy routes mattered more than borders. Data mattered more than territory. Influence mattered more than declarations. The pace of change increased. The pressure intensified. And while the world evolved rapidly, the United Nations struggled to adapt, where the UN began to struggle. In my view, the UN did not fail suddenly. It eroded slowly, processes became heavier, decision-making slowed, consensus became harder to reach. Resolutions were written, committees were formed, statements were issued, but wars continued. Humanitarian crises deepened, and powerful nations increasingly acted alone. Over time, people began to notice the widening gap between what the UN promised and what it actually delivered. Words piled up. Results did not, and trust began to thin. My honest view on the UN. In my opinion, the United Nations is not a failed idea. It was built with intention, with hope, with belief in cooperation. But today, it has become an ineffective machine. It moves too slowly for a world that no longer waits. It relies too heavily on agreement in a world driven by competition, and it struggles to enforce decisions when major powers choose to ignore them. That doesn't make the UN immoral. It doesn't make it malicious. It makes it outdated. And when institutions stop producing results, power begins to look elsewhere. Enter Donald Trump. This is where Donald Trump enters the conversation again. Trump has always been openly critical of large international institutions. His argument is blunt. They talk endlessly. They delay decisions. They protect process more than they protect people. According to Trump, power doesn't come from documents or resolutions. It comes from leverage, from pressure, from decisive action. And if I'm being honest, there is truth in that argument. History shows us that many major global conflicts were not resolved by committees, but by negotiations backed with real influence. Why Trump's argument resonates. The United Nations has passed countless resolutions that were ignored. It has condemned wars that continued anyway. It has warned leaders who never listened. Meanwhile, powerful nations regularly bypass the UN when its processes conflict with their interests. So when Trump says, "This system isn't working," he's pointing at something many people already feel. The world doesn't function on ideals alone. It functions on power dynamics. If you think this conversation matters, take a moment to like this video. And if you're new here, hit the subscribe button so we can continue exploring these ideas together. I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment and share how you see this moment in history. Where I pause. But here is where I slow down. Concentrating too much power in too few hands has consequences. History is very clear about this. Power without balance can create order in the short term, but instability in the long term. When only the strongest voices decide, smaller nations lose influence. Sometimes they lose protection entirely, and once trust erodes, systems weaken from within. A deeper tension. This is the tension we're living with right now, between effectiveness and fairness, between speed and inclusion, between power and principle. The UN represents one side of that tension, Trump represents another, and neither side offers a perfect answer. What we're really seeing is a world searching for balance in a system that no longer feels stable. The pressure beneath the surface. This pressure isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself, but it's there. In diplomatic meetings, in economic decisions, in security alliances. It's the sense that the old rules don't fully apply anymore, that the systems built for another era are being stretched beyond their limits, and that stretch is becoming harder to ignore. Where we are now, still ongoing. So this is where we are right now, a moment where institutions are questioned not because people want chaos, but because reality demands answers. A moment where power feels less predictable, where old structures are under strain, where assumptions that once felt permanent no longer feel guaranteed. Donald Trump's return did not create these pressures, but it brought them into focus. It forced conversations that had been quietly avoided. It exposed tensions that had been managed but never resolved. And whether people agree with him or not, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The world is no longer comfortable pretending that the existing system works the way it once did. The questions are growing. The pressure is building, and the direction forward is becoming harder to ignore. What makes this moment so difficult to define is that it doesn't come with clear boundaries. There is no official announcement that the old system has failed. No formal declaration that a new global order has begun. Instead, we're living inside the transition. And transitions are uncomfortable. They don't offer certainty. They don't provide clear instructions. They exist in the space between what no longer works and what hasn't fully formed yet. That's where the world is right now. Power, reality, and human nature. At the center of all this is a truth that history has never allowed us to forget. Power matters, no matter how advanced our institutions become, no matter how refined our language grows, no matter how noble our ideals sound, power remains a defining force. It shapes decisions. It influences outcomes. It determines whose voice is heard and whose concerns are postponed. The United Nations was built to soften the raw edges of power, to slow it down, to surround it with rules and dialogue. But power does not like to be slowed forever. Eventually it pushes back. Why? Strong nations are reasserting themselves. Over the past several years, we've seen a pattern emerge. Strong nations are acting more independently. They are prioritizing national interests over collective agreements. Not because cooperation is evil, but because urgency has returned to global politics. Security threats feel closer. Economic competition feels sharper. Technological dominance feels existential. In these conditions, waiting for consensus can feel like weakness. This is where Donald Trump's worldview resonates. He speaks the language of leverage, of pressure, of direct negotiation. To many, that feels more honest than carefully worded statements that lead nowhere. The emotional undercurrent people often miss. But beyond policy and power, there is something else happening. Fatigue. A quiet exhaustion with systems that promise much and deliver slowly. People around the world see suffering continue despite endless meetings. They see wars drag on despite repeated condemnations. They begin to feel that words have lost their weight. This emotional undercurrent matters, because when belief fades, systems weaken. Not from attack, but from indifference. Where I agree and where I don't. In my view, Trump is right about one thing. The current system does not work the way it claims to. Efficiency matters, action matters, results matter. But I also believe that raw power alone is not wisdom. Power without restraint has a long and painful history. It creates winners quickly and instability even faster. A world run purely on strength leaves little room for fairness, dignity, or trust. And trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. The danger of overcorrection, this is the risk of our moment. When systems fail, the temptation is to swing too far in the opposite direction, from slow cooperation to aggressive unilateralism, from dialogue to dominance. History shows us that overcorrection often creates new crises. The answer to inefficiency is not recklessness, and the answer to weakness is not cruelty. Balance is harder, but balance lasts longer. The question. No one can avoid, so the real question becomes this. Can global cooperation evolve without collapsing? Can institutions like the United Nations reform themselves without losing legitimacy? Or will the world move toward a fragmented system where power is negotiated directly between a few dominant players? This question has no easy answer, but avoiding it is no longer an option. What reform would actually require? Real reform would be uncomfortable. It would mean faster decision-making, clearer accountability, less bureaucracy. More consequences? It would require powerful nations to accept limits, and smaller nations to accept responsibility. It would demand honesty instead of ritual. Whether the UN is capable of this remains uncertain. Institutions are slow to change, especially ones built on compromise. Trump's role in this moment. Donald Trump did not create these structural weaknesses, but he refuses to ignore them, and that refusal forces a confrontation with reality. Even critics must acknowledge this. Sometimes disruption is what reveals truth, not because the disruptor is always right, but because comfort can hide decay. The world feels less predictable, and why many people sense that the world feels less stable today. Alliances feel conditional, rules feel flexible, certainty feels rare. This is what happens when systems are questioned but not yet replaced. It's not collapse, it's transition. And transitions test patience, wisdom, and restraint. The human cost of getting this wrong. If we get this wrong, the cost won't be abstract. It won't be theoretical. It will be measured in displacement, in instability, and conflict. That's why this conversation matters. Not because it's political, but because it's human. What I believe the world needs. In my view, the future cannot be built on denial, nor can it be built on domination. The world needs systems that acknowledge power without surrendering to it, systems that move faster without abandoning fairness, systems that are realistic without becoming ruthless. That balance is difficult, but it's necessary. Why this moment will be remembered. Years from now, people may look back on this period not as a single event, but as a turning point, a moment when the world quietly admitted that old structures no longer fit modern realities. Trump's return may be remembered not for what he destroyed, but for what he forced the world to confront. In my view, neither blind faith in institutions nor blind faith in power will carry us forward. The future demands clarity, honesty, and courage. Courage to reform what still matters, and courage to let go of what no longer serves us. I'm Janus Juno. If you've stayed with me through this conversation, thank you. If you value thoughtful, calm analysis that looks beyond headlines and into meaning, then hit the subscribe button. Share this video with anyone who believes the world deserves better answers. And most importantly, leave a comment. I genuinely want to know how you see this moment. Because the future isn't shaped by institutions alone, it's shaped by understanding.